This is Mark Newman, the president and founder of Precision Analytical, and this video is to assist you as you interpret your results for cortisol on the Dutch Plus. When you look at the Dutch Plus, you're going to see the 5 salivary-free cortisol points on the first page, and then those are going to be added up here for the total. So that's a total of your salivary-free cortisol for those 5 measurements. And then you can also see the total of the metabolites here. All of this is going to be repeated on page 5. So we're going to start in on page 5 and just work through there. And on page 5, you'll also see the calculations for the cortisol awakening response. What we want to look at there is, if I could refer to a study, is here's a study where it shows that the difference between a waking cortisol sample and a sample 30 to 40 minutes later, that difference is called the cortisol awakening response. And that's what we're trying to look at here, in addition to all the other things that are important as it relates to cortisol. But what this study showed is that a big car, an exaggerated cortisol awakening response, correlated with people who went on to get major depressive disorder. Similarly, if you have a flat car, that's going to be a problem too in terms of symptoms that might be related to low cortisol or low HPA axis activity. When you get to page 5, you'll see, among other things, the free cortisol pattern. That's where we want to look. And then again, you can see the total of that here, but you can see the calculation of whether this cortisol awakening response is large, or in this case, it's rather flat. So you can see in the text, we went from 1.6 to 2.2, and that's an increase of about 0.6 or 39%. What we normally get is around 50 to 160%, or 1.5 to 4.0. So you're going to want to look at that increase relative to both the percent increase and the absolute increase to make sure that we're considering all that in terms of assessing whether that cortisol awakening response is appropriate or not. So how are we going to work our way through this data? We're essentially looking for a number of different things that might lead us to conclude that someone's got overactive cortisol or HPA axis activity, or underactive or appropriate. And there are a few other areas of dysfunction we can look at. But as we work our way through it, we want to look at the free cortisol. So you can see, again, the 5 points there. We want to look at that pattern throughout the day, right? If the pattern is popping up at bedtime, that's going to be a problem. Is there dysfunction in that diurnal pattern? And then what are the levels throughout the course of the day? You can see this patient is low to low normal throughout most of the day, and that's relevant. There's not a lot of free cortisol. The free cortisone, we're going to look at just for a secondary look at that diurnal pattern, that up and down pattern. So in a case like this, it's a pretty close match, and in which case we're not really going to pay a lot of attention to the cortisone. When there's a distinct difference between the two, then that might change the interpretation a little bit, and we'll get into some examples of that at the end. So we're going to go through some more simplified explanations first, even though this is complex because there are a lot of variables that we're looking at here. But at the end, we'll look at some of the odder patterns that you'll see and how we might work our way through interpreting some of those, because they can be quite interesting. So in a case like this, we're looking at the pattern throughout the day, and then when we zoom in and look at that actual CAR, both at 30 and 60 minutes, we can see that, and then again, those calculations will be in the paragraph below, and we're assessing that for underactivity, overactivity, and then we also want to look at the metabolites, right? The metabolites here tell you the total output of cortisol for the day. So free cortisol is the most important piece to look at, because that's what's getting into your cell, that's what's bioactive, but it's only about 1% of the total. So if we want to know how much output there is from the adrenal gland throughout the course of the day, the metabolites of cortisol represent about 70+% of the cortisol. So that's really your best marker for overall output. So in a case like this, the free cortisol is relatively low, right? If the metabolites here were also low, it's a pretty simple picture of just low overall production of cortisol. In this particular case that we see here, that's not the case. We have relatively elevated levels of metabolites. And that's one of the advantages of Dutch. That's why we still have urine collections with these salivary collections, is because you can see in a case like this, you're relatively low for free cortisol and relatively high for the metabolites of cortisol, which implies what? That implies increased cortisol clearance. When are we going to see that? You're going to see that a lot in obesity. So in obese patients, you're going to see this metabolite value go up, not necessarily the free cortisol. If someone's on too much thyroid medication, that upregulates cortisol metabolism. You'll see that same sort of look. So the way we would describe a patient like this is they have a reasonable cortisol awakening response, although relatively low levels of free cortisol, but there's a lot of cortisol production. Lastly, we can look at, does the cortisol hang out in its active form, cortisol, or its inactive form, cortisone, predominantly? In a case like this, you can see it's favoring slightly cortisol. So what that is just looking at the total of the cortisol metabolites and the total of the cortisone metabolites, because that's the best way to assess whether cortisol is in its active form or not. And whether that's good or bad may depend on the overall picture. If you have someone with relatively low levels of cortisol, then favoring cortisol over cortisone may actually help you because you're keeping it in its active form. On the other hand, if you have elevated cortisol and symptoms of elevated cortisol, and this gauge here, this fan style gauge, is leaning towards cortisol, that's going to exacerbate a high cortisol situation potentially. If you have it leaning in the other direction towards cortisone, then you could say that cortisol is being pretty readily deactivated to cortisone. So we want to put all these pieces together. What's the overall up and down pattern? How much free cortisol do we have at different parts of the day and as a total for the day? What's the total of the metabolites, and what does that tell us about cortisol production and cortisol clearance? And then do we have a metabolic preference here between cortisol and cortisone? And then you can look on the steroid pathway in there to see the types of things that influence cortisol, like inflammation, low thyroid, or cortisone. Now, once we put that all together, how complex the case is depends on what we're looking at. In a case like this, it's relatively simple, right? You have an appropriate up and down pattern of cortisol, right? So if you had a cortisol that just stayed high all day, you'd need to start thinking about potentially Cushing's disease, an adrenal or a pituitary tumor that's pushing out all this cortisol. If it goes back down where it's supposed to at some part of the day, that's not as likely to be the case. In a case like this, it would simply seem that the HPA axis is really turned on high. So the total of the free cortisol is very, very high. It's particularly high right when they wake up and in that early part of the day. And then we can see from the metabolites, they confirm this story. Yes, there is a lot of cortisol being made and excreted. The actual cortisol awakening response doesn't really add that much to the story, right? If you eliminated this first point, you'd still see that there's a ton of cortisol in the early part of the day. There are a ton of metabolites, right? So the cortisol awakening response, the magnitude of this change is not that abnormal. But you do have, obviously, a very overactive HPA axis. Now, in a case like this, we've got a more nuanced case where the cortisol awakening response adds to the picture. So if you tested this patient here only, you'd get a normal result, right? High normal, but still normal. And then throughout the day, everything's normal, right? But when you look at that waking sample, the difference between the waking sample and 30 minutes, that's a very large cortisol awakening response, which would tell you that the patient either has a high level of perceived stress or they're responding to stress in an exaggerated manner. And the studies tell us that that is an important marker for potentially overactive HPA axis, an overactive stress response. And that's why we want to look at this data. So you'll want to look at, in a case like this, that is potentially a sign of overactive HPA axis. That is an exaggerated CAR. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, right, we looked at a couple where you have elevated cortisol, an exaggerated CAR. Here are two examples, and we're just looking at the salivary results here, but both of these are relatively low, right? But one of the things that the cortisol awakening response can help you to see is the severity of the situation. So in the top case, you can see where is that cortisol awakening response. It doesn't exist, right? The person wakes up, the act of waking acts as a stress on the HPA axis or simulates it, so to speak, and we're expecting this to jump up and it doesn't, right? It's also getting a little bit higher than it should be at bedtime, so there's really a very dysfunctional diurnal pattern of cortisol and it's very low, right? On the second example, yes, it's relatively low. We're low here, we're low here, we're creeping into the range here, and then in the afternoon it looks okay. But so, you've got relatively low levels of free cortisol, but what the cortisol awakening response adds into the picture is that all is not lost here, right? This is a milder case of dysfunction because there is still some resilience to the HPA axis, to the stress response in a case like this. Do they both need addressing in terms of their HPA axis and cortisol support? Potentially, but the case on the bottom is much closer to a quote-unquote normal type of response than the case on the top, even though the overall levels of cortisol, free cortisol, are probably about the same. So in these cases, what we can see, and this is why, again, it's important to add the cortisol awakening response, is you will see situations where everything's pretty normal and the cortisol awakening response adds to the picture. We already saw the one on the top with this exaggerated response. And if you look at the bottom, you look at all of these points are in the normal range, yet there is no lift at waking. So the patient may not be responding to stress the way that they're supposed to, and that is a significant finding. So let's just go through a few of these cases in terms of different patterns that you're going to see. So again, we're trying to assess whether the HPA axis maybe has a dysfunction in the diurnal pattern, maybe it's overactive, maybe it's underactive, maybe the cortisol metabolism is upregulated as it is in a case like this. So when we break it down, we're going to look at the free cortisol. What do you see in a case like this? Well, the free cortisol is relatively low, right? The pattern throughout the day is pretty flat. There's not a lot of an up and down there, right? The other thing you see with the cortisol awakening response is it's pretty flat. That is not much of a cortisol awakening response. So it's relatively low, right? But then we start to look elsewhere and we see this patient is actually making quite a lot of cortisol, right? When we look at the total of the metabolites, we can see, hey, there are quite a few metabolites being made. So this person is pumping out a decent amount of cortisol, yet their free levels of cortisol remain relatively low. Now, one of the advantages to our test is that we use mass spectrometry, and in doing so, we can also measure cortisone. Now, there's a complexity to this that I have to explain that's not simple, okay? And that is this. Whether you're looking at cortisol in the urine or in the saliva, those come from the saliva gland, of course, and the kidney, right? In both of those spaces, the kidney and the saliva gland, there's heavy deactivation of cortisol to cortisone. So there's this deactivation, right? In the kidney, your body doesn't want cortisol to hit the aldosterone receptor and raise your blood pressure, so it moves it over to cortisone. The same thing happens in the saliva gland. So because that's happening in the localized tissue, the cortisone not only represents cortisone, the inactive form, but it also, in a sense, represents part of the cortisol. So what I mean by that is in a case like this, what you seem to have is that in the saliva gland, a lot of that cortisol is ending up over here as cortisone. So when cortisone tells the same story, so if it was way down here for this patient, just like the cortisol, it would simply confirm, hey, there's not very much cortisol. In a case like this, there may be a little bit more free cortisol than what this total and what this diurnal pattern seems to imply, because some of it's getting stolen, if you will, over to the cortisone. So it's a little bit higher than maybe what the free cortisol would imply. But when you want to ask the question, well, okay, is this patient having some sort of systemic sort of robbing of the cortisol by deactivating it to cortisone? Well, because that issue is happening in the local tissue, this is not the best place to ask that question. right? There's this back and forth of cortisol throughout the entire body. And the best way to ask that question is to look at the metabolites. So if you look at this patient, they have way more cortisone metabolites than cortisol, right? So what's happening in the saliva gland seems to be happening systemically, and that's not always the case. So you want to defer to this marker to ask the question, am I making a lot of the active metabolites or the inactive metabolites? Well, in this case, there's a big favoring towards cortisone. So what's going on in this patient? They are making quite a lot of cortisol, but it's basically running away from them, right? It's being readily deactivated to cortisone, and in its inactive form, it doesn't have any biological activity, and it's being metabolized by the liver for excretion, right? So you're making a lot of cortisol, but it's running away from you. When does that happen? That happens sometimes in obesity. It happens in, as we mentioned before, hyperthyroidism. So too much thyroid medication will give you this sort of a picture, but it's not a picture of somebody who's simply not making cortisol and has maybe an adrenal gland that's just not able to make cortisol. That is not the story in this particular patient. If that was the case, you'd see low markers sort of across the board. Now, here is the opposite story, right? With a patient like this, the cortisol is relatively high. Okay, so it has an appropriate up and down pattern. That's important, but it's a little bit high, particularly in the morning, right? And as we look at the CAR, that's what, about 3.5 going up to 8. So that's right at the edge of the range. That's a high normal to high cortisol awakening response. So when this patient gets up, their cortisol is leaping up quite a lot, right at the top of the range. So maybe there's some overactivity going on there. Now, as we look at the cortisone, you can see that it's not up here, right? It's quite a bit lower. So here's a patient where in the localized tissue, there's not a lot of deactivation of that cortisol. And in that sense, this cortisol might, just to a small degree, be a little bit of an exaggeration of what's going on systemically with cortisol. And if we want to ask further, well, okay, is there a preference for active cortisol? So the deactivating of cortisol to cortisone, if you have a favoring of the opposite to where it's staying in that active form, and that's what we can see here, that happens when inflammation, hypothyroidism is a very common. So if you have low thyroid, you make cortisol, and your body has a hard time deactivating it to cortisone, and it has a hard time clearing it as these terminal metabolites that we're measuring. And that's seen in the literature, that you see this type of a pattern oftentimes in people who have low thyroid. So as you're treating patients with thyroid conditions and potentially adrenal conditions, you want to keep that in mind. But again, part of the reason why this cortisol result is high is not just because the patient's making too much. Maybe that's part of the picture, but there's also a fairly massive metabolic preference for not deactivating and not metabolizing and not clearing that cortisol, because you can see the free cortisol is elevated and the metabolites of cortisol are not. So there's this sort of this, what we often refer to as sluggish cortisol clearance, which is most commonly, again, associated with low thyroid. Now, again, all of the cases are not going to be this complex, but this is the way in which you want to work through your data. How does the cortisol look at different times? What is the magnitude of that cortisol awakening response? Does the cortisone pattern match that pattern? That may shift your interpretation just slightly. And then we want to look at the total of the metabolites to get an idea of total cortisol output, which then again gives us some inference and implication of what's going on in terms of the rate of cortisol clearance, which can be abnormal in some cases. The other reason, shifting gears here, that we'd want to look at cortisone is in the rare case where there's a contamination. So let's say that this patient puts hydrocortisone, which is cortisol, puts cortisol cream on their knee at bedtime, okay? And their cortisol result goes up to a very high level at bedtime. Now you ask yourself, okay, is that real? Did I contaminate the sample? Well, if the cortisone result goes with it and is also elevated, that implies that that's a real physiological production of cortisol, and part of that's going to be represented as cortisone, right? So that says it's real. If, on the other hand, the cortisone is way down here, either you've got some massive metabolic preference for cortisol around bedtime, but what's more likely if the patient's using hydrocortisone cream, which again, hydrocortisone is cortisol, is that there's a contamination. And we see this very rarely, but when it does happen, the cortisone then becomes your best representation of the cortisol pattern throughout the day. So that's another use of cortisone. Again, that's going to be rare that you're going to see that, but when that situation happens, you'll be very glad to have that additional piece of information to assist you with the interpretation. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions as a provider, please reach out to the laboratory, and our clinical consultants would be happy to walk you through, particular cases or questions you have, or questions on treatment for a particular case that you're working with. And we look forward to continuing to work with you.